when did you first find, were near-death experiences the first kind of glimpse into this area of interest?
Basically, yeah. I was born in '87, and I found out about near-death experiences. I really started researching them when I was 19 in 2006.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and
what was it about near-death experiences that really kind of piqued your interest and made you kind of go in this other direction to your standard materialistic atheist kind of viewpoint?
Two things. The very first thing was the near-death experience of Howard Storm, and how he was an atheist, super convinced that there was nothing after death, and then he had this experience and was completely blown away by it. Then I also read an article by Neil Grossman called "Who's Afraid of Life After Death," and that kind of opened my mind to the idea that there could be something to this, and that's when I started to read more about the literature. But to get back to the whole thing about my book, there were some things that became evident to me early on, but that other people weren't kind of pushing the issue so much, and that is that near-death experiencers, those who have the experience, they become convinced personally that it was real, and they also say that it was realer than real, the experience, and it's self-evidently real to them. And I always thought that was, kind of, well, but then it's clearly real, but many people still, wouldn't, and many wouldn't take it seriously, and many skeptics, just completely dismiss that.
Yeah.
So I don't know, you had not checked out my book, right?
I haven't had time, I'm afraid, no.
Okay, no worries. But anyway, so this book is a philosophy. Many people who argue for near-death experiences argue from a scientific viewpoint. I mean, on your show, I know you've talked a lot about veridical perception during out-of-body experiences, and that is kind of the scientific approach. But what I've created with this book is a philosophical argument arguing for the reality of an afterlife. So very roughly, if you're familiar with kind of like the ontological argument or the cosmological argument, I mean, those are philosophical arguments rather than scientific data. But this argument that I've been created is kind of a mix between rational arguments and empirical data, because it's based on 4 non-controversial facts about near-death experiences. And these are, the first one is, I'm going to overgeneralize here because for brevity and simplicity. I go into more detail in the book, but since we have a limited time here, I can't talk about all the details.
Sure.
But okay, so the first premise is that everyone is convinced when they have a near-death experience. The second premise is that everyone describes it as realer than real. It was vastly more real than everything about this experience that we are having right now of daily life. The third premise is also extremely important, and that is that we can't find anything that will predict whether someone will or will not have an NDE, or what kind of an NDE they will have. Nothing physiological, nothing psychological, and nothing sociological. So near-death experiencers are representative of the population as a whole. So if, say, 10 to 15% of the population are atheists and or materialists, then 10 to 15% of NDEers were atheists or materialists before their NDE. And a similar thing holds true for whatever kind of other attributes you're looking for in the population. And the fourth premise of the argument is that at least millions, probably tens of millions of people, and maybe even hundreds of millions of people have had near-death experiences. So my argument is that these 4 facts considered together essentially demonstrate beyond any reasonable doubt that there's an afterlife. And I do this by introducing first a thought experiment, and then also by elaborating on the realer than real aspect of the book. So is it all right for you if I just keep on talking and introduce the thought experiment?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So Imagine, for instance, that some very rich people created a very well-protected room. You couldn't access this room in any way, shape, or form ever, no matter what you did. And but they did let people into the room. So, but those who were selected to go inside were selected completely at random. So, and when they went in, they could not take with them anything into the room that they could record anything in there with.
Mm-hmm.
But they could bring tools with them to research what they found in there. And then when they went out of the room, they would have to kind of all the things that they researched, what they found in the room in were confiscated. And so when they got out of the room, they would have no evidence whatsoever of what was inside of the room.
Mm-hmm. Outside of their own testimony.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And here is where the interesting questions arise. After how many randomly selected people going through this process, and everyone reporting essentially the same thing about what they found there, is it reasonable to start believing in them and infer knowledge from their cumulative and converging testimonies? And to what degree is the extraordinary nature of the claim of what they claim is in there relevant to this number? If we start off by just looking at it from mundane claims, you can take any silly example, like for instance, a golden banana.
Mm-hmm.
If one person walks into the room, comes out and says, "Oh, there's a golden banana in there. I saw it, I touched it. I did some research on it to confirm that it really was there and it's not just some kind of hologram or whatever." Well, I mean, that person could be lying.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have or just be careless in your investigation. But if you had 10 people, all randomly selected with no connection to each other, coming out and reporting the same thing, then it's a lot less likely that they would all be lying about the same thing, or that we would all be careless in their investigation, etc. After 100 randomly selected people going through this, how many of the rest of us would really be skeptical of the testimony? And after 1,000 people go through this, I mean, would there even be a single skeptic? So that is very generally and quickly the thought experiment that I introduced into the book.
It's interesting, although could you not argue that it's certainly accepted that these people experience very similar things, although it's just not necessarily indicative that what they experience is what they think they experience. So they could go in and see a golden banana, for instance, in the room, not realizing that it's actually a hologram created by hidden projectors in that room. From what they can see, it's a golden banana. They're not allowed to touch it or whatever, but from all their senses they can see it's a golden banana, whereas actually it's a projection of light created as an illusion of a golden banana. So in the same way, could it be that near-death experiences are what people report and they see exactly and they experience exactly what they say they experience, but it's not necessarily indicative of an afterlife? It may be an indicative of the fact that our human brains are all very similar and produce a similar illusion. I don't believe that's the case, but from an argument point of view, could that, playing devil advocate, could that also not be a reasonable argument to make?
That is at first, of course, at very least. I was going to go into the whole near-death experience as well, but concerning the whole hologram in the room thing, they will get the tools to take with them into the room that can kind of research whether it could be a hologram in some way, and kind of I'm blanking on the English term right now, but exclude the possibility by doing this kind of research. Also, the people outside of the room, once the first people start to go into the room, the rest of us can kind of give them instructions on, okay, this is what we need you to check for, so that it is not a hologram. So they go into the room, they do the research, and they come out and can say, no, we checked for those alternative explanations, and there was no evidence for it in the room. But moving on to what you said later about the near-death experience, that we see fairly similar things, but it could be our brains generating it. That gets into the whole realer than real aspect of the near-death experience. So I don't really know where to begin talking about this, but like to the people who have near-death experiences, they often come back and say that it was self-evidently an ultra-real reality. And in other words, it was self-evident from an experiential point of view for them that no, this was not just a hallucination, this was clearly real. And many skeptics will say, well, it could be a hallucination. How do they know? How can they, exclude that possibility in a reliable way? And this gets into kind of philosophy, and an important analogy I draw is between dreaming. Right now, we believe that everyday life is more real than our dreams at night. But why do we believe that? And this is what I go into in detail in the book. When you dream, it's very confusing. It's much less vivid, and it's much less consistent. What I mean by that is that when you wake up, you always wake up as the same being. I mean, you wake up as Darren. You live in the UK. You look the same way. You live in, and all that stuff. And you know that this has been true for years and decades of your life. Whereas the scenarios we encountered in the dream, they come into existence and pop out, just in a matter of minutes or seconds, or however long we perceive it to be in the dream. So everyday life is a much more consistent experience than your dream. What near-death experiencers say is, well, this was a more consistent experience than everyday life. This was eternity. I had always been there. I will always be there. The friends I met there are those I have known forever. And same with the environment. I've always been in that realm. So these are just some examples, and I provide a lot more different examples in the book. I can't go into all the details now. But.
So we were saying about the fact that it's people report it as much realer than real, and all the different experiences they have of being, in a different place where they've always been and where they belong. Many could argue that people also experience this, and indeed studies have been shown that these kind of experiences also take place under the influence of hallucinogenic drugs like ketamine, especially, which is believed to be caused by stimulation of certain parts of the brain or erratic activity in certain parts of the brain. At least it's correlated to that. So could it be that although near-death experiences do describe these as being certainly not hallucinogenic and certainly real, or hallucinatory, rather than, and certainly real, could it not be that they are in fact hallucinations, but hallucinations in the same sense that people experience under the influence of ketamine and other hallucinogenic drugs, who also describe that they go to another place and that they are very similar experientially?
That's a good point, and there are two things I think of immediately that comes against that. The first one is kind of, many people who experience things on ketamine or magic mushrooms or DMT or ayahuasca, to many, but not to all, but to many, they get the perception that they are accessing some kind of spiritual dimension, reality, or something. So some have argued that these drugs do not create hallucinatory
experiences,
false, false experience, exactly, and but rather unlock access to it.
And some would argue that that's backed up by studies that show that brain activity decreases under the influence of these hallucinogenic drugs, although that's contended.
Okay, yeah, I'm not 100% up to date on those studies, but I have looked on some of them. Yeah.
So how would you argue the experiences that that take place from people with different kind of religious or social backgrounds who live in different parts of the world, who during near-death experiences generally see scenes and beings in their near-death experiences that are consistent with their religious belief and their culture, as opposed to, so a Hindu wouldn't necessarily see Jesus, but they would see a Hindu god. And native or indigenous tribal people would, one famous one is some tribal man had a near-death experience and found himself in a canoe going down a river to an island that was representing kind of the next stage, whereas people certainly in modern culture wouldn't experience that. So what are your thoughts on that?
First of all, the afterlife is, if the afterlife is real, it's not some kind of, and this is what I think is very skeptics are uncharitable. An afterlife is clearly not some kind of ultra homogeneous place. It is like we'd probably have way more variety than everything on our planet. So that we take different kind of get different experiences. It is not so wild if we access different parts of the afterlife. Second, and this is I think very important to keep in mind, the afterlife would of course as be a super evolved place with the ability to know exactly what we need and also that where to meet us, where we're coming from. I mean, if I were to die, I would probably want to find myself in some kind of meadow or a field, but others might want to find themselves, on the ocean or a soccer field or whatever. So it could be that they're giving us kind of what we need to see to not be too overwhelmed. I mean, if a Christian sees Vishnu or whatever, it might throw them off more than necessary. It might be easier for them to see, Christ or whatever.
So would that mean that the near-death experience or the experience of death is kind of governed or orchestrated by some other being, some higher being for us?
Yeah, exactly. And I think some near-death experiencers have also suggested that when we have a near-death experience, it's not really an accident, it's not random, it was probably pre-planned before we came here, because one thing many say is that our lives here are chosen and we have a rough blueprint for them before coming in. So whatever content we have in near-death experience might be just pre-planned, but of course that does sound a bit ad hoc as well. So just one more thing about the drugs you mentioned earlier there, ketamine and DMT and stuff. Since near-death experiencers are representative of the population as a whole, certain percentage of the population have done these drugs. So even if a very small percentage of people, they have done DMT and ketamine, and then they have had near-death experience as well. So they can report about the differences between them. And when they do, they agree that both are ineffable and completely alien, but that the NDE was way, 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 way higher and more coherent and self-evidently real, etc.
So I suppose, what are your thoughts on the philosophy of materialism in terms of consciousness, that it's perfectly self-evident without really the need to challenge it that the brain produces consciousness because it is so closely correlated with brain activity and mind? Mind and brain activity is so very, very closely correlated, we could argue strongly a causational relationship between them.
Yeah, I mean, no one denies that the brain is strongly correlated with our mental lives and everyday life. I mean, alcohol changes our thinking, as all drugs do, and a blow to the head is gonna alter our thinking as well. So in the book, I make a huge point about the fact that at least some people understand these correlations. For instance, Evan Alexander understands this probably much better than both you and I. He's a neurosurgeon, and but he was still convinced by the ultra reality of the NDE world, and this gets into kind of so if materialism was an adequate explanation, saying it's so there's such a strong correlation otherwise that there doesn't seem to be a correlation during an NE should be disregarded because there's such a strong correlation otherwise, I don't really see how that kind of why we should think like that. So I mean
What are your thoughts on the argument that if I mean, are you kind of a dualistic perspective that mind and brain are two separate things? Is that general?
I'm on a, like more like idealist,
more of an idealist.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. So, what would you say would be the argument that, well, you know, we can also strongly argue the causational correlation between brain and mind, because we can switch off conscious experience with anesthetics, or, you know, we can switch off memory and mind with degenerative brain diseases like Alzheimer's. And I suppose, you know, we can alter personalities by having severe injuries to the brain, or by certain procedures, medical procedures to the brain.
I apologize. I don't know. I think I lost the first part of what you said there.
So what would you think to the argument that we can reasonably argue that the brain creates consciousness because of the effects of anesthesia and Alzheimer's and brain injury and things like that?
Okay, yeah. Well, the first thing we have to understand is that if we are here and role-playing these human beings, we are not just role-playing the body. We are also role-playing the mind. So if we come here to experience what it's like to have, you know, different damages or alternative experiences of the mind, then, you know, that's how I see it from the perspective of you know, the afterlife theory, that that, say for instance, you want to experience what it's like to get brain damage, for instance, you know, then so I mean, if these are silly examples, but just to illustrate, if I cut off my legs, I won't be able to walk, and if I, you know, remove a part of the brain, I won't be able to talk. But this will just, you know, be true for this level of reality, and it's, I mean, if I cut off my legs and then I die and I go to heaven, why should my legs still not, you know, their removal should not hinder my ability to walk in the higher reality, and I think something similar can be said for brain damage and stuff like that. Like if I lose my ability to speak here, it shouldn't affect how that I can think in an NDE in the same way that cutting off my legs shouldn't affect my ability to move in an NDE. It's kind of the same thing.
So why, if consciousness continues after the death of the brain, why does it not continue during general anesthesia?
Because the brain isn't shut down. We haven't disengaged from the body yet. We're sort of kind of intertwined with the brain during while the body is still alive, and during an anesthesia we are very much alive. So
so it seems we're kind of floating in between a dualistic idea that the brain and that the mind acts through the brain, and kind of an idealistic perspective that the mind is the brain in physical form. So somewhere in between there, which is kind of where I am as well. I'm torn between the two possibilities. I don't think the brain creates consciousness, as you say. I just think it's a lot more mysterious than we think. So are near-death experiences the main or the only subject you research in this kind of field of interest, or are there other phenomena that you also look at?
I have a casual understanding of many other phenomena, but I'm not an expert in any way, shape, or form now. So if you take someone like Sharon Hewitt-Rowlett, for instance, she has researched many other of these phenomena, but I haven't.
What are your thoughts on
what?
I was just going to say, what are your thoughts then on some of the most common kind of skeptical arguments from folks like I don't know, Susan Blackmore or Daniel Dennett or others that have opposed the near-death experience as evidence for an afterlife?
Well, I mean, Daniel Dennett, please correct me if I'm wrong here, and I don't want to speak about something I don't have absolute knowledge of, but has he ever even really commented on this stuff or read the literature? I mean, I know Susan Blackmore has, but with Dennett, I'm not so sure.
Daniel Dennett, maybe not. He's just kind of one of the names I could think off the top of my head. There are others that are probably more that are more beneficial to talk about rather than Daniel Dennett, but I can't think of him at the moment. Someone
okay.
like Gerald Verley or Keith Augustine, and I suppose Michael Shermer and folks like that who have done more into near-death experiences.
Yeah, I mean, if you read what they have to say about the realer than real aspect of NDEs, for instance, it becomes strikingly obvious, and this is true for Susan Blackmore as well, that they haven't listened at all to what the near-death experiencers are saying, not at all, and they just seem to brush it aside in terms of the realer than real aspect. And yeah, I go into some detail on that in the book. So
do you think then it'd be theoretically impossible for the brain during a near-death experience to allow for a heightened sense of realer than real being an illusion as opposed to being actually realer than real as such?
Well, the near-death experience is described as vastly more real in all sense, and with vastly, I do mean vastly. I mean, I think, for instance, the brilliance of an NDE, it's trillions of times more brighter than it's here, and the same is true for everything else as well. So if you take the idea that this is a common philosophical question, how do we know that the brain of our dream character is not currently generating this experience of everyday life? It becomes, because it's even when you charitably understand what near-death experiencers are saying, it becomes even more ridiculous to them to suggest that the brain creates the near-death experience than it is the brain of our dream characters that are currently creating this experience of everyday life, including our experience we are having right now of the brain. Many people forget this, but we actually have an experience of the brain. It's part of our experience of everyday life. For instance, if you look at all the molecules and the cells, etc., in the brain, then you're talking about how phenomenologically detailed our experience of the brain is. And when our experience of our dream brains, when we dreamed, it's of course much less detailed. And the experience of our soul or spirit, or whatever you want to call it, in the afterlife, it's phenomenological detail there is of course trillions of times more detailed. So all the reasons we have for thinking that we have a brain in everyday life are vastly amplified in the NDE world, for coming to the conclusion that the NDE is not caused by the brain. And I know this might sound very confusing, and it's very hard for me to kind of condense what I've talked about this stuff in the book right here, but that's a rough kind of guideline. I apologize.
So I suppose probably the best question to, I suppose, lead off with would be, what do you think from your book is the single most persuasive piece of evidence of near-death experiences that suggests to you that there is some form of afterlife and that consciousness is not created by the brain?
Exactly what I talked about in the beginning. It convinces everyone. They are realer than real, according to everyone, and they are representative of the population as a whole, and they are all convinced. So 100% of the population agrees that there is an afterlife once they have had a sufficiently deep near-death experience themselves. And we have testimonies like this in the tens of millions of people.
Okay, so where can people find you and contact you and find your book? And what's the book called, of course?
Well, I'm sorry, what did you say?
And what's the name of the book, of course?
Okay, the name of the book is Why an Afterlife Obviously Exists, a thought experiment and realer than real near-death experiences. And it can be found on Amazon or any other place, bookshop online, basically.
And where can people get in touch with you should they wish to ask you any questions on it?
They can Google my website, but it's not very fancy. But in general, my email is jensamberts@gmail.com. So.